Hello, friends. This week we're starting to look at applying ethics to issues in education. So I thought I might start us off by thinking about the rights involving children. This includes both rights over children and then also the rights of children. So let's get started. I recently was reading a book called To Whom Do Children Belong? And the subtitle of this book is Parental Rights, Civic Education, and Children's Autonomy. It's written by Melissa Moschella. It's a fascinating book. I highly recommend it. And as she talks about to whom do the children belong, of course, we have to make this caveat that we're not talking about owning children. Human beings aren't owned in that way. But what she means is who is ultimately responsible for the children? Whose responsibility is it to make sure that children are brought up well? One of the earliest philosophers to try to answer this question was our old friend Plato. And his answer was the state, the government, is the one most responsible for the children. In fact, in Plato's ideal government, they have to use force to take all the children from their parents and give them all the exact same education, going so far as to make the knowledge of who the real parents are impossible to discover. So he imagines a kind of communal society where people have children, and then those children are taken at a very young age by the government to be reared. And at first, this involves just basic nutrition and playtime, think of it like daycare. And then after that, as they get older, the educational experts in the city would look and say, okay, this child seems to have an aptitude for making things or building things, so we're going to give them an education appropriate to that. This one seems to be kind of scrappy and getting into fights a lot, so maybe we should train them to be a soldier. This one over here, they seem to be really interested in math and science, and so we'll give them the education of a scientist. This whole time, the children are completely taken care of by the government, by the state. In his society, he thinks that it's probably better for children not to know who their real parents are, because then if they did, they would have these divided loyalties. They would feel loyalty to their parents, and their parents would feel a special bond or connection to their children that would be above the bond and connection they'd feel to all the other children. And he feels like this would make for a disharmonious society. It wouldn't be as smoothly running because people would be playing favorites all the time. So he thinks the best thing to do is to keep the knowledge of whose child is whose to very, very highly restricted to maybe a few people who keep records on these things, because you don't want siblings to accidentally get married to each other later on. So we need to have some record keeping of whose kids are whose, but we don't want the people themselves to know, because that would cause this disunity in our society. So basically, anybody that's say 20 years older than you would just call dad or mom, and anyone that is 20 years younger than you would just call my son or my daughter. And so everybody would be equal and together, and we would all belong to each other and belong to the government. Now, it's kind of a funny thing to think about, like, where you just wouldn't even know. It'd be like, sometimes here in the West, we made fun of the communists in the 80s, calling everyone comrade. And this goes far beyond comrade. You would be all equally fathers and sons and daughters and mothers of everybody. And there would be no family connections anymore. Now, there's, of course, all sorts of problems with this. One of them is, how would you start such a society? Plato has this funny idea. He said, well, the only way to do it would be to kidnap a bunch of children and then basically lie to them, tell them that the parents that they believed were actually their kidnappers, and we're rescuing them because we're all equal, and then you could start the society that way. You'd have to start it with a giant lie and probably a kidnapping. So it's kind of terrible to imagine a society like the one that Plato suggests. But what would be so wrong about the state controlling and being fully responsible for all of the children, that everybody would be equally cared for by everyone else. Well, one of the things that Plato's students, Aristotle, said about this was he said that if we adopted such a method for organizing our society, well, okay, you'd have 500 dads or 1,000 moms, but that just means that you would be neglected by all these people, not taken care of. And this is the normal tragedy of the commons that we're used to these days, where if that park belongs to everybody, well, no one's going to take care of it. If this river or this lake belongs to everybody, well, that's the one that's going to be polluted the most. And so if the children belong to everybody, then no one's going to care about them. No one's going to sacrifice for them. There's something about the children being your children, especially your children, not your children in the way that, well, all the children are your children. But no, these children are my children. And so you can advocate for them. You can hope to advance their causes. You can take special care of them and wish them well. You can devote your resources to them. And you can do that because they're yours specifically, not yours in a collective sense. So this idea that the children would simply belong to the state is probably not really a good idea. Well, who else could we give the children to? Who else could have the ultimate responsibility for the children? Well, probably the other candidate would be the parents. And there's two reasons for this. So one, and this is kind of a biological reason, the child is a result of the union between the husband and wife, between the two people. That you would need male and female because of the way human beings are, they reproduce sexually. And so you would have the man and the woman, the husband and wife, the male and the female. The union between the two of them produces the child. And so the child is a kind of extension of that union. So in the same way that the union between husband and wife has a kind of privacy and autonomy, that they're in charge of their own union, again, within limits, like you don't want people to be harmed or abused through something like this. Well, in the same way, that marriage union extends towards the privacy and autonomy of raising a child. So the way Thomas Aquinas said it, that in the same way that the woman's body, the womb, nourishes and protects the child before they're born, well, the family is like the womb for the child as they grow up. That they're still protected and nourished in this very special biological way by their parents that's not replaceable by, say, some third party. Especially not something like a collective third party like a government or a state. That the biological union that produces the child is the same one that protects and develops, promotes, and is obligated to that child. The second reason is that the obligation to raise one's children well is not an obligation that we can simply give away to someone else. Now, there's elements of it that we can delegate. This is not saying that that someone who puts their young child in daycare for them to be able to go work, there's something wrong with that. It's not that. You can delegate responsibilities, but you can't delegate that responsibility in an absolute sense. If you say, oh, I'm dropping off my child with their caretakers and I will not see them again, I've simply delegated all of the care to this caretaker that I've paid, and so it's fine, I've done my duty. That's not true. You always have the obligation to raise your own children. And you can't set that aside without violating what is owed to your own offspring. By bringing the child into the world, you're in a way indebted to that child. You've made a promise to it, or you have a duty or to it that you can't simply give away or decide you don't want. That this obligation cannot be taken away from you. So we can bring these two pieces together, the state and the parent together, through a kind of social contract. We don't have to simply choose one or the other and say, if we go along with the parent, then we say, well, the state has no role to play. In the same way that if we went with, said, well, the state has a strong obligation, that, well, now the parent is just an accessory. They merely provide some kind of biological raw material, and then as soon as the child is old enough to be placed into the care of professionals or experts designated by the state, then the parent is no longer valuable. We don't need to make such an extreme view. So we could say, well, the parent, again, with this idea of like the family as a kind of womb for the nourishment and care of the child, that care is then delegated to the state or to the community in order to provide a kind of education that the parent wouldn't be able to give on their own. And they wouldn't be able to give for whatever reason, either time or expertise or aptitude, but that we're willing to agree to give that part of our duties to the state, but not in an absolute way. We haven't given everything to the state, just the part that we can't do ourselves. So those are some frameworks to think about the rights concerning the child, such as the right to make decisions on behalf of the child and how they should be brought up. But what about the rights that a child has on their own rights? The United Nations produced a convention on the rights of the child that includes some 54 articles or statements involving what children's rights should be. And I encourage you all to read through it. Now, here in the United States, we've signed this Convention on the Rights of the Child, but it's never been ratified. We're one of only 3 countries in the United Nations that haven't ratified it, although we have signed it, so it does provide a kind of ideal that we can work towards. And so here's a few that I thought were particularly interesting. So the first 2 that I wanted to point out have to do with education. So number 28, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child say that there should be free primary education for all children, that a child is entitled to have a basic education involving literacy and math and citizenship and so on, that this is not something that you could simply not do if it became too expensive or controversial, but that this is something that all children are entitled to have. These things like basic literacy and numeracy, they're not optional. We have to provide them. Now, as far as secondary education goes, they suggest a variety of types of secondary education. Some might be purely educational, so think of a standard American high school or advanced placement kind of high school, all the way to vocational training or apprenticeships, but that there should be some options in there. They should be made available, perhaps free or at a reduced cost, but the government should at least make these available to all children. And then secondly, the things that should be part of the educational content. So the primary one is the personality and talent development of the child. The child should be able to grow into who they are and to be given the resources through education to be able to do so well. Education should include curriculum that teaches the respect for human rights and freedoms, the respect for parents, for culture, for their own language, and for national values. So you shouldn't have a kind of education that teaches your children that they should be ashamed of who they are, or that their language is inappropriate or not right, or not sophisticated enough, or that their national values are dirty or subpar. Those kinds of things should not be part of an educational content. And then, of course, lastly, that education should teach respect for the natural environment. You notice that these big 3 here are all respect words, and this is something that I found kind of inspiring about the UN Convention here on the rights of the child, was that this high view of respect, and this is a kind of character trait or virtue. So they're teaching these habits, these character traits of respecting our fellow fellow humans, their freedoms, their differences, and the kind of pride and appreciation of one's own culture and land and customs. Number 12, I thought was fascinating, free speech. So children have the right to give their opinions freely on issues that affect them. This applies to everything from being able to express yourself in art or literature to storytelling, all the way to having your voice heard in court when it's an issue that concerns you. So, if you say were in the middle of a custody hearing about your own placement, you should have the right to have your voice heard, and for those who are in authority, the judges or the parents, should be able to listen to you and respect your opinion. Number 18, this goes along with what we had discussed earlier. Parents are the main people responsible for the upbringing of a child, and that the best interest of the child should always be paramount. So this is a twin concern. It's the who and the how are both put into one little article here. So who should be the main people responsible for the upbringing of a child? The parents. How should they do it? They should have in mind what's in the best interest of the child. Not what's in their own best interest, not what's in the best interest of the government or the leader or the state, but what's in the best interest of the child should always be paramount. And then lastly, and I think this is one of the most difficult ones, number 17, this concept of mass media availability. So a child, according to the UN Convention, has the right to get information from radio, TV, books, newspapers, and the internet. So the ability to access mass media. Now, it is up to the adults, to those responsible, to exclude harmful sources, information, or things that would be damaging to a child's well-being and upbringing. But that these kinds of things should be available. We're not supposed to keep our children in little bubbles where they don't have access to information, they're not aware of what's going on in the larger world, to shelter them in this harmful way. And that governments should encourage the publication of helpful resources. They should sponsor or perhaps directly create materials that children can access. So think of something like public broadcasting, programs like Sesame Street, the sponsorship of public service advertisements, children's books, and so on. That these are things that children have a right to, and that we should be helping them access these materials and not try to prevent them from seeing them. So I think, as you can see, children exist in a very complex set of interactions and relations, involve both obligations and rights. What's encouraging about this topic is that we all agree that the final shared goal is for children to grow to fully participate in their communities as adults, and that is all our job as the adults to help them get there. I hope you enjoyed this short presentation. The next 2 weeks are very exciting for me. Educational ethics is one of the most fruitful areas where all of the things that we've been discussing come together. The ideas about rights, virtues, responsibilities, and happiness all converge when it comes to education. I hope you all really enjoy the readings and find the discussions fruitful this week. Until next time.